Some things in life we repair with our hands, others repair our hearts. Thomas knew this better than anyone. He worked in a small bicycle repair shop in the town of Lipova. Every day he fixed old bicycles. One day a man came with a broken bicycle. He said it belonged to his father. Thomas repaired the bicycle. It was old, but beautiful. He gave it to the man and thought the story ended. Then he found a photograph hidden in the bicycle frame. There was an address and a name. Thomas decided to visit the owner. What he discovered shocked him. The real owner died 10 years ago. The man who came for the bicycle was not his son. So who was he? Why did he want this particular bicycle? Write in the comments where you are watching from. If this mystery intrigued you, give a like and subscribe. Tomorrow, I have another story that will get you. The morning sun cast long shadows through the workshop windows, painting stripes of gold across the concrete floor where Thomas Novak had spent the better part of 30 years. The air smelled of machine oil and metal, a scent that had become as familiar to him as his own breath, as comforting as a warm blanket on a cold winter night. He stood at his workbench, hands already stained with grease, though the day had barely begun, studying the intricate gears of a watch mechanism his father had left him decades ago. It sat in a small wooden box, polished smooth by years of handling, a reminder that precision and patience were not just skills, but a way of life. Thomas was 55 years old, his hair more silver than brown now, his hands marked with the calluses and scars of honest work. He had built a life in this small town of Lipova, a place where everyone knew everyone, where time seemed to move slower than in the bustling cities beyond the mountains. His bicycle repair shop sat on the corner of Main Street and Oak Avenue, a modest building with peeling paint and a hand-carved wooden sign that read Novak Bicycles in fading letters. The building had belonged to his father before him, and his grandfather before that, 3 generations of men who believed that a well-maintained bicycle could carry a person not just from place to place, but through life itself. Inside the workshop, bicycles in various states of repair hung from hooks on the walls or rested on wooden stands, each one waiting for Thomas to breathe new life into tired frames and rusted chains. He knew every bicycle that came through his door, could tell you the story of each dent and scratch, could feel in his hands whether a wheel was true or if a bearing needed replacing. This knowledge had not come easily. It had been earned through thousands of hours of work, through failures and successes, through the patient teaching of his father, who had shown him that every tool had a purpose and every problem had a solution if you were willing to look for it. Thomas lived alone now, had lived alone for 3 years since his wife Anna passed away, after a long illness that had slowly stolen her strength but never her smile. She had been the light in his life, the one who reminded him that there was more to living than work, who had filled their small house with laughter and music and the smell of fresh baked bread. Her absence was a weight he carried every day, felt most keenly in the quiet evenings when he returned home to an empty house where her chair still sat by the window, where her books still lined the shelves, where everything remained exactly as she had left it, because he could not bear to change anything. They had never had children, a sorrow that had dimmed somewhat over the years, but never quite disappeared. And now, in his later years, Thomas found himself wondering what legacy he would leave behind, what mark he would make on the world beyond the bicycles he repaired and the customers he served. The workshop had become his sanctuary, the place where he could lose himself in the rhythm of work, where problems had clear solutions and broken things could be made whole again. His hands knew the work so well that he barely had to think, could disassemble a gear hub or true a wheel, while his mind wandered to memories of Anna, of his father, of summer days from his childhood when the world had seemed full of endless possibility. The town of Lipova itself was a quiet place, home to maybe 2,000 people, most of whom had lived there all their lives. It nestled in a valley between rolling hills covered in pine forests, a place where the air was clean and the pace of life allowed for conversation and contemplation. Main Street had a bakery, a post office, a small grocery store, a church with a bell tower that chimed every hour, and a handful of other shops that had survived the passage of time and the pull of the modern world. People here still greeted each other by name, still stopped to chat on street corners, still believed that a handshake was as good as a contract. Thomas was part of the fabric of this community, had repaired bicycles for nearly everyone in town at one time or another, from the children who brought in bikes with flat tires and broken chains, to the elderly who trusted him to keep their old cruisers running smoothly. He charged fair prices, never took advantage of anyone's ignorance, and often did small repairs for free if he knew the customer was struggling financially. This was not just good business, it was the way his father had taught him to live, with integrity and compassion, treating others as he would wish to be treated. His closest friend was his neighbor, Mrs. Novakova. No relation, despite the shared name, a widow in her 70s who brought him soup on cold days and worried about him like a mother hen. She lived in the house next to his, separated by a white picket fence that Thomas repaired every spring, and she had appointed herself the guardian of his well-being, constantly suggesting that he needed to get out more, meet people, perhaps find companionship again. Thomas appreciated her concern, but had no interest in replacing Anna, felt that what they had shared was irreplaceable, and he was content with his solitude, his work, and his memories. He also had a young helper named Martin, a boy of 17, who came to the shop after school and on weekends, eager to learn the trade, asking endless questions about how things worked and why. Martin reminded Thomas of himself at that age, full of curiosity and energy, and he took pleasure in passing on the knowledge his father had given him, showing the boy how to read the wear patterns on a chain, how to adjust brake calipers for perfect stopping power, how to listen to the sound a bearing made to know if it needed grease or replacement. Perhaps this was his legacy, not children of his own blood, but the knowledge he could pass on, the skills that would outlive him, carried forward by young hands learning an old craft. The morning routine never changed, had not changed in all the years since Thomas had taken over the shop from his father. He arrived at 7 o'clock, unlocked the heavy wooden door with the same brass key his grandfather had used, flipped the sign from closed to open, and started a pot of coffee on the small burner in the back corner. While the coffee brewed, he walked through the workshop, checking on the bicycles waiting for repair, making mental notes of what needed to be done, planning his day with the methodical approach of a man who understood that good work could not be rushed. He swept the floor, organized his tools, wiped down his workbench, small rituals that prepared him for the day ahead. By 8 o'clock, the first customers usually began to arrive, people dropping off bicycles on their way to work, children with bikes that needed quick fixes before school, elderly folks who came as much for conversation as for repairs. Thomas listened to them all, nodded sympathetically at their problems, assured them that he would take care of everything, and meant it sincerely. There was something deeply satisfying about taking a broken thing and making it work again, about seeing the smile on a child's face when they got their bicycle back, about knowing that his work mattered in small but meaningful ways. This particular morning felt different somehow, though Thomas could not have said why. The sun seemed brighter, the air clearer, and he felt an unusual sense of anticipation, as if something important was about to happen. He dismissed the feeling as foolishness, the imagination of a man who spent too much time alone with his thoughts. But still it persisted, a quiet whisper at the back of his mind. He poured his coffee, black with no sugar the way he had always taken it, and settled onto his stool at the workbench, ready to begin another day. The first customer of the morning was old Mr. Kovar, who came in every Tuesday, like clockwork, to have Thomas check the tire pressure on his ancient 3-speed bicycle, a task that took maybe 5 minutes, but which Mr. Kovar insisted on paying for, pressing coins into Thomas's reluctant hand. They chatted about the weather, about Mr. Kovar's garden, about nothing and everything, the comfortable conversation of two men who had known each other for decades. After Mr. Kovar left, a young mother brought in her daughter's pink bicycle with training wheels, one of which had come loose. Thomas tightened it, adjusted the seat height which the child had outgrown, and sent them on their way with a wave, refusing payment for such a simple task. The morning passed in this familiar pattern, a steady stream of small repairs and friendly conversations, the kind of work that filled his days with purpose, if not excitement. Around mid-morning, Martin arrived, bursting through the door with the energy of youth, already talking about a bicycle he had seen online that he wanted to save up for, some modern marvel of carbon fiber and advanced gearing that cost more than Thomas's entire inventory. Thomas smiled and listened, asked questions, encouraged the boy's enthusiasm, while gently suggesting that some of the old ways still had merit, that a well-built steel frame could last a lifetime if properly maintained. They worked together in companionable silence for a while, Thomas showing Martin how to overhaul a bottom bracket, explaining the importance of cleaning and greasing every component, of taking pride in workmanship that no one might ever see, but which made all the difference in how a bicycle performed. This was what Thomas loved most, these moments of teaching and connection, the passing on of knowledge and skill from one generation to the next, the continuation of a tradition that stretched back through his father and grandfather and beyond. He had no way of knowing that before the day ended, a stranger would walk through his door, carrying a bicycle that would change everything, that would pull him out of his quiet routine, and into a mystery that would challenge everything he thought he knew, that would force him to confront questions about trust and deception and the hidden depths that lie beneath the surface of even the most ordinary lives. The stranger arrived just after noon, when the sun was at its highest point, and the workshop had grown warm despite the open windows. Thomas was finishing lunch, a simple sandwich that Mrs. Novakova had brought him that morning, along with her usual lecture about eating properly, when he heard the bell above the door chime. He looked up to see a man standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright sunlight outside, making it difficult to see his features clearly. The man was perhaps 40 years old, tall and thin, with dark hair and a nervous energy that showed in the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot. He wore ordinary clothes, jeans and a button-down shirt, nothing remarkable, but there was something about him that Thomas found unsettling, though he could not have explained exactly what. The man carried a bicycle, or what remained of one, holding it awkwardly as he stepped into the shop. The bicycle was in terrible condition, the frame covered in rust and dirt, the tires flat and cracked, the chain hanging loose, the handlebars bent at an odd angle. It looked like it had been abandoned in a field for years, left to the mercy of weather and time. And Thomas wondered why anyone would bother trying to salvage such a wreck. Most people would have simply thrown it away and bought a new one, but something in the way the man held the bicycle, carefully despite its condition, suggested that it meant something to him. Thomas stood and wiped his hands on his work apron, greeting the stranger with a polite nod. The man did not smile, just nodded back and lifted the bicycle onto Thomas's workbench with surprising gentleness. Up close, Thomas could see that beneath all the rust and neglect, the bicycle had once been a fine machine, probably built in the 1960s or 70s, judging by the design, with a steel frame that still looked solid despite the surface corrosion. It was a classic touring bicycle, the kind that serious cyclists had used before the age of lightweight materials and advanced engineering, built to last for decades if properly maintained. The man cleared his throat and spoke in a quiet voice, almost apologetic. He said the bicycle had belonged to his father, who had passed away several years ago, and he had finally decided to restore it as a way of honoring his memory. He explained that he had found it in his father's garage, buried under boxes and forgotten tools, and realized that he wanted to ride it again, wanted to feel connected to the man who had raised him. Thomas listened carefully, nodding in understanding, familiar with this kind of request. People bringing in bicycles that carried emotional weight far beyond their monetary value. He had repaired many such bicycles over the years, understood that sometimes what people wanted was not just a working machine, but a piece of their past made whole again. The stranger asked if Thomas could restore the bicycle, said he did not care about the cost or how long it took, just wanted it done properly, wanted it to be exactly as his father would have remembered it. Thomas examined the bicycle more closely, running his hands over the frame, checking the integrity of the welds, spinning the wheels to see how badly they were damaged. It would be a significant amount of work, he told the man honestly. The bicycle needed almost everything replaced: new tires, new chain, new cables and housing, new brake pads, probably new bearings throughout, a complete overhaul from top to bottom. The frame would need to be cleaned and treated for rust, the chrome polished, the paint touched up where it had chipped away. It would take time and parts and patience, but yes, he could do it, could bring the bicycle back to life. The stranger seemed relieved, his shoulders receding slightly, and he thanked Thomas with genuine gratitude. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, asking how much deposit Thomas needed to begin the work. Thomas quoted a fair price, half up front and half upon completion, the same terms he offered everyone, and the man counted out cash without hesitation. As he handed over the money, he mentioned that his name was Pavel Dvorak, and that his father's name had been Karel Dvorak. Thomas wrote down the information in his ledger, the same cloth-bound book his father had used to track repairs, noting the date and the description of the bicycle and the customer's contact information. Pavel gave him a phone number, said to call when the bicycle was ready, and turned to leave. Just before he reached the door, he paused and looked back at the bicycle on the workbench, and for a moment, Thomas saw something in his expression that he could not quite read, something that might have been sadness, or perhaps something else, something darker. Then the moment passed and Pavel was gone, the bell chiming again as the door closed behind him. Thomas stood looking at the bicycle for a long time after the stranger left, feeling that same strange sense of anticipation he had felt that morning, stronger now, more insistent. There was something about the whole encounter that did not sit right with him, though he could not pinpoint what exactly. Perhaps it was the way Pavel had held the bicycle, with care, but also with a kind of tension, as if it were fragile or dangerous. Perhaps it was the way he had avoided eye contact, looking at the bicycle or at the floor, but rarely at Thomas directly. Perhaps it was simply the condition of the bicycle itself, so thoroughly neglected that it seemed impossible it had been stored in a garage, seemed more likely it had been left outside for years. Thomas shook his head, dismissing his unease as the product of too much time alone, too much silence in which his imagination could wander. A customer was a customer, and a bicycle was a bicycle, and his job was to repair it to the best of his ability, nothing more and nothing less. He began the work that same afternoon, starting with the most basic task of cleaning away years of accumulated dirt and grime. He filled a bucket with warm, soapy water and scrubbed the frame carefully, revealing the original paint color beneath the filth, a deep blue that had once been beautiful. As he worked, Martin watched with interest, asking questions about the bicycle's age and design, commenting that it was a shame someone had let such a nice bicycle deteriorate so badly. Thomas agreed, but said nothing about his misgivings, kept his doubts to himself as he always did, preferring to observe and think rather than speak prematurely. Over the next several days he worked on the bicycle whenever he had time between other repairs, methodically replacing parts and restoring function. He removed the old chain, which crumbled in his hands, it was so rusted, and installed a new one. He replaced the brake cables and adjusted the calipers until they worked smoothly. He took apart the wheel hubs and repacked the bearings with fresh grease, trued the wheels so they spun perfectly straight. The work was meditative, required focus and precision, and Thomas lost himself in it gratefully, finding peace in the familiar rhythm of disassembly and restoration. It was while he was working on the seat post, trying to remove it from the frame where it had become stuck with rust and age, that he made the discovery. The post finally came free with a metallic screech, and as he pulled it out, something fell from inside the hollow frame tube and clinked onto the workbench. Thomas picked it up and found himself holding a small metal cylinder, carefully sealed, about the size of his thumb. His heart began to beat faster as he carefully opened it, his hands suddenly unsteady. Inside was a rolled-up photograph, old and faded, but still clear enough to see. It showed a young man, probably in his 30s, standing next to the same bicycle Thomas was now restoring, the blue paint bright and new in the sunshine. On the back of the photograph, written in careful handwriting that had faded to brown with age, was a name and an address. The name was Karl Svoboda, not Karl Dvorak as Pavel had claimed. The address was here in Lipova, just a few streets away from Thomas's shop, a house he passed sometimes on his walks. The date written below the name was from 1978, nearly 50 years ago. Thomas sat down heavily on his stool, staring at the photograph, his mind racing with questions. Why had Pavel given a false name for his father? Why had this photograph been hidden inside the bicycle frame? And most importantly, who was the real owner of this bicycle? That evening, Thomas closed the shop earlier than usual, his mind too distracted to focus on work. He locked the door and walked home through the quiet streets of Lipova, the photograph tucked safely in his shirt pocket, its presence a constant weight against his chest. The sun was setting behind the western hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, but Thomas barely noticed the beauty of it, too consumed by the questions circling in his mind. He had lived in this town his entire life, knew most of the families by name. yet he could not recall anyone named Karel Svoboda. The name was not familiar, though that in itself meant little. People came and went, memories faded, and 50 years was a long time. He wondered if the man in the photograph was still alive, still living at the address written on the back, or if, like so many others, he had moved away or passed on, leaving only traces behind. When he arrived home, the house felt emptier than usual, the silence more oppressive. He made himself a simple dinner of bread and cheese, ate without tasting it, his thoughts elsewhere. Mrs. Novakova knocked on his door around 8 o'clock, bringing him a slice of apple cake she had baked, and she immediately noticed that something was troubling him. She asked what was wrong, her motherly concern evident in her lined face, and Thomas found himself telling her about the bicycle, the stranger who had called himself Pavel Dvorak, and the photograph hidden in the frame. Mrs. Novakova listened carefully, her expression growing more serious as he spoke. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, then asked to see the photograph. Thomas retrieved it from his pocket and handed it to her. She held it close to her eyes, squinting in the lamplight, and then her breath caught. She knew this man, she said quietly, her voice suddenly subdued. His name was indeed Karel Svoboda, and he had lived on Elm Street, just 3 blocks from where they sat now. He had been a teacher at the local school, a gentleman who loved cycling and spent his weekends riding through the countryside. But he had died, she told Thomas. Died nearly 10 years ago in a house fire that had destroyed his home and everything in it. There had been an investigation, she remembered, because the fire had started in the middle of the night and Karel had not escaped. The authorities had ruled it an accident, something to do with faulty wiring. But there had been whispers in the town, rumors that perhaps it had not been entirely accidental. Mrs. Novakova could not remember all the details. It had been a long time, and her memory was not what it used to be, but she was certain that Karel Svoboda had died, and that his house had burned to the ground. Thomas felt a chill run through him as he listened. If Karel Svoboda had died 10 years ago, and if his house had burned completely, then how had this bicycle survived? And more importantly, who was the man who had brought it to him, claiming it had belonged to his father? Mrs. Novakova suggested that perhaps the bicycle had not been in the house when it burned. Perhaps it had been stored somewhere else, in a shed or a friend's garage. That would explain how it had survived, but it did not explain why someone would lie about their identity, or why the photograph had been hidden so carefully inside the frame. Thomas thanked her for the information and the cake, promised he would be careful, and watched as she returned to her own house, worry evident in the set of her shoulders. After she left, Thomas sat in his living room, Anna's empty chair across from him, and tried to make sense of what he had learned. Every answer seemed to lead to more questions. Every explanation opened new mysteries. He thought about going to the police, telling them about the strange customer and the discrepancies in his story. But what would he tell them? That a man had given a false name when bringing in a bicycle for repair? That did not seem like a crime, barely seemed worth investigating. Perhaps there was a simple explanation. Perhaps Pavel was using a nickname or a stepfather's name. Perhaps the confusion about Karel's surname was innocent. But Thomas's instincts, honed by decades of careful observation and attention to detail, told him that something was not right. He decided that before involving anyone else, he would do some investigating of his own. The next morning, he told Martin that he needed to run an errand and left the boy in charge of the shop. He walked to Elm Street, found the address that had been written on the photograph, and stood looking at the empty lot where Karl Svoboda's house had once stood. The lot was overgrown with weeds and wild grass, a concrete foundation still visible among the vegetation, blackened by fire even after all these years. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, rusted and sagging, and a faded for sale sign hung crookedly from a post. The neighboring houses looked tired and worn, their paint peeling, their yards neglected, as if the tragedy of the fire had cast a shadow that still lingered. Thomas walked around the perimeter of the lot, studying it carefully, not sure what he was looking for, but feeling compelled to see the place where Karl Svoboda had lived and died. There was nothing to see, really, just weeds and rubble and the skeletal remains of a foundation. But still he looked, trying to imagine what the house had been like, trying to picture Karl riding his bicycle up the driveway after a long ride through the countryside. An elderly woman emerged from the house next door, eyeing Thomas suspiciously, and he approached her politely, introduced himself, and asked if she had known Karl Svoboda. The woman's expression softened slightly, and she nodded. Yes, she had known him, had been his neighbor for over 20 years before the fire. He had been a good man, quiet and kind, always willing to help if someone needed it. He had taught history at the school, she remembered, had a passion for the subject that made his students actually enjoy learning. He had never married, had lived alone in that house with his books and his bicycle and his simple routine. The woman's eyes grew sad as she spoke, and Thomas could see that the memory of the fire still troubled her. She had been the one who called the emergency services that night, she said, had woken to the smell of smoke and seen the flames through her bedroom window. By the time the firefighters arrived, it was too late. The house was fully engulfed, and poor Karl never had a chance. They found his body in what had been his bedroom, overcome by smoke before the flames reached him. At least, that was what they told her. It had been a terrible shock to the neighborhood, such a tragedy for such a good man. Thomas asked gently if Karl had any family, anyone who might have inherited his possessions. The woman shook her head. As far as she knew, Karl had no living relatives, no children, certainly. His parents had died years before, and she thought he might have had a brother once, but was not sure. Everything he owned had burned with him. There had been nothing left to inherit. The fire had been so hot and so complete that investigators found almost nothing salvageable in the ruins. Thomas thanked the woman for her time and walked slowly back to his shop, his mind churning with this new information. If everything Karl owned had burned in the fire, then the bicycle should not exist. It should have been destroyed along with everything else, melted and twisted in the intense heat. Yet here it was, sitting on his workbench, real and solid and undeniably present. Someone had lied to him. That much was certain now, and the question was why. What was so important about this particular bicycle that someone would create a false identity to claim it? What secrets did it hold beyond the photograph he had already found? When he returned to the shop, Martin was helping a customer, a young woman whose bicycle had a flat tire, and Thomas waited patiently until the repair was finished and she had left. Then he asked Martin to watch the front while he worked in the back, claiming he needed to focus on a complicated repair. In truth, he wanted privacy to examine the bicycle more thoroughly, to search for other hidden items or clues that might explain the mystery. He worked methodically, checking every tube in the frame, every hollow space where something might be concealed. He removed the handlebars and found nothing. He took apart the seat and found nothing. He examined the fork and the rear triangle and found nothing. For hours he searched, growing increasingly frustrated, beginning to think that perhaps the photograph had been the only thing hidden in the bicycle. Perhaps he was chasing shadows and seeing conspiracies where none existed. But then, just as he was about to give up, he noticed something odd about the bottom bracket. The part of the frame where the pedal cranks attached. It looked slightly different than it should have. The threading seemed wrong somehow, and when he tried to remove it, he found that it had been modified. Someone had carefully machined a false bottom bracket shell, one that appeared normal from the outside, but which actually had a hollow compartment inside. His hands trembled slightly as he worked to remove it, using special tools and careful pressure, and finally it came free. Inside the hollow compartment was a small waterproof bag, sealed tight, and inside that bag were documents. Thomas spread them out on his workbench with a sense of growing unease. There were old letters, yellowed with age, written in Czech, and as he read them, his understanding of the situation began to shift. The letters were correspondence between Karel Svoboda and someone named Josef, discussing something that had happened during the communist era, back when Czechoslovakia was still under Soviet control. The letters were careful, written in coded language that tried to obscure their true meaning, but Thomas had lived through those times, remembered the fear and the suspicion and the need to be cautious about what you said and to whom. He understood what he was reading, understood that these letters documented something dangerous, something that people had risked their lives to preserve. Karel Svoboda, it seemed, had been involved in the resistance movement, had helped people escape to the West during the years when the borders were closed, and attempting to leave was considered treason. The letters talked about routes and contacts and safe houses, about people who had been helped and people who had been caught. They mentioned names, specific individuals who had collaborated with the authorities, who had betrayed their neighbors for small rewards, or simply out of fear. These were dangerous documents, the kind that could have gotten Karel killed if they had been discovered during those dark years. And apparently, even after the regime fell and Czechoslovakia became free, these documents still held power, still contained information that someone wanted kept secret. Thomas sat back, his mind reeling. He thought about the fire that had killed Karel, the fire that had been ruled an accident, but which had sparked rumors of something more sinister. What if it had not been an accident at all? What if someone had set that fire deliberately, trying to destroy these documents, trying to erase the evidence of their collaboration with the old regime? But if that was true, then whoever set the fire had not known that Karel had hidden the most damaging documents inside his bicycle frame, had not known that the proof of their betrayal still existed. And now, 10 years later, someone had come looking for that bicycle. Someone who knew or suspected what it contained. The man who called himself Pavel Dvorak must have known about the hidden documents, must have been searching for them, perhaps had even been searching for years. But who was? Was he one of the collaborators named in the letters, or was he working for someone else, someone who wanted the past to stay buried? Thomas carefully photographed each document with his phone, making sure he had clear images of every page, every name, every detail. Then he returned them to their waterproof bag and sealed it again, replaced it in the false bottom bracket, and reassembled everything exactly as it had been. He needed time to think, needed to decide what to do with this information. Going to the police was an option, but he worried about what might happen to the documents if he did. In a small town like Lipova, there was no guarantee that the police force did not include someone with connections to the people named in those letters. someone who might want them destroyed. He thought about his responsibility, about whether it was his place to bring these secrets to light, or whether he should simply finish repairing the bicycle and give it back to Pavel without saying anything about what he had found. But that felt like a betrayal of Karol Swoboda's memory, felt like letting the people who had collaborated with an oppressive regime escape justice. Anna would have known what to do, he thought with a pang of grief. She had always been better at navigating complicated moral questions, better at seeing the human dimension of difficult choices. He wished desperately that he could talk to her, could hear her calm voice helping him think through the options. Instead, he was alone with this burden, forced to make decisions that felt too large for one person to carry. That evening he barely slept, lying awake in the darkness, thinking about Karol Swoboda and the fire that killed him, thinking about the resistance fighters who had risked everything for freedom, thinking about the collaborators who had sold out their neighbors. He thought about the man who called himself Pavel and wondered what he would do when he came to collect the bicycle. Would he check for the documents immediately? Would he become suspicious if Tomas asked too many questions? And what would happen to Tomas himself if Pavel discovered that he knew about the hidden compartment? The next morning, Tomas made a decision. He would not go to the police. Not yet. But neither would he simply hand over the bicycle without understanding more about who Pavel really was and what he intended to do with the documents. He would continue working on the bicycle as promised, would restore it to perfect working condition. And when Pavel called to collect it, Tomas would be ready with questions of his own. But first, he needed to learn more about the people named in those letters, needed to understand the full scope of what Karol had documented. He spent his lunch break at the town library, searching through old newspaper archives on the computer, looking for any mention of the names he had seen in the documents. The library in Lipova was a small brick building that smelled of old paper and floor polish, maintained by a single librarian named Mrs. Kermakova, who had worked there for as long as Tomas could remember. She greeted him with surprise when he entered, commenting that she could not recall the last time he had visited, and he offered a sheepish smile, admitting that he was not much of a reader these days. She showed him to the computer in the corner, explained how to access the digitized newspaper archives, and left him to his research with a promise to help if he needed anything. Tomas had never been comfortable with computers, preferred the tactile reality of tools and metal to the abstract world of screens and keyboards, but he managed to navigate the archive system well enough. He started searching for the names he had seen in Karol's letters, typing them carefully into the search box, and waiting as the system processed his request. The first name he searched was Josef Marek, the person to whom most of Karol's letters had been addressed. The results came back quickly, dozens of articles spanning several decades. Tomas began reading chronologically, starting with articles from the 1970s. Josef Marek had been a prominent figure in the local resistance movement. The article said, a man who had helped organize underground networks that smuggled people across the border to Austria and West Germany. He had been arrested in 1979, tried in a closed court on charges of treason and sedition, and sentenced to 15 years in prison. But he had served only 6 years before being released during a general amnesty in 1985, part of a brief period of liberalization before the regime tightened control again. After his release, Joseph had kept a low profile, working as a janitor and avoiding politics entirely. Then came the Velvet Revolution in 1989, the peaceful overthrow of the communist government, and Josef Marek had emerged as a voice for accountability and justice. He had testified before special tribunals about the activities of the secret police, had named names and provided documentation of who had collaborated and who had resisted. He had become something of a local hero, respected for his courage and his refusal to let the crimes of the past be forgotten. But in 1993, Joseph Marek had died suddenly of a heart attack at the age of 52. The obituary described him as a fighter for freedom who had never recovered fully from his years in prison, whose health had been permanently damaged by the harsh conditions he endured. Thomas sat back, processing this information. Joseph had been Karl's contact in the resistance, the person he worked with to help people escape. And Joseph had died just 4 years after the revolution, before he could finish his work of bringing collaborators to justice. Had his death truly been natural, or had someone silenced him before he could reveal everything he knew? The next name Thomas searched was one that had appeared repeatedly in the letters, always with a tone of fear and caution: Antonin Krupka. The search results made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. Antonin Krupka was still alive, still living in Lipova, and he was someone Thomas knew, though not well. Krupka owned several businesses in town, including the largest grocery store and a construction company that had built most of the new houses in the area over the past 20 years. He was wealthy and influential, served on the town council, donated generously to local charities. Thomas had always thought of him as a pillar of the community, a successful businessman who had built his fortune through hard work and smart investments. But according to Karl's letters, Antonin Krupka had been an informant for the secret police during the communist era, had reported on his neighbors and colleagues, had provided information that led to arrests and imprisonments. The letters detailed specific instances, dates and names and consequences, painting a picture of a man who had betrayed others, not out of conviction but out of ambition, who had used his position as an informer to eliminate business rivals and advance his own interests. After the revolution, Krupka had reinvented himself as a capitalist entrepreneur, had used money he acquired through questionable means during the transition period to start his businesses. He had never faced any consequences for his collaboration, had never been called to testify or held accountable, had simply moved forward as if the past did not matter. Thomas felt sick as he read, understanding now why these documents were dangerous, why someone might kill to keep them hidden. If the information in Karl's letters became public, Antonin Krupka would be ruined. His reputation would be destroyed, his business relationships shattered, his position in the community obliterated. And in a country that was still grappling with how to address the crimes of the communist era, there might even be legal consequences, prosecutions for collaboration and betrayal. Thomas searched for more information about the fire that killed Karl Svoboda, typing the date into the archive system and pulling up newspaper articles from that time. The coverage was minimal, just a few brief articles noting that a house fire had claimed the life of a retired teacher, that the cause appeared to be electrical in nature, that the investigation was ongoing. There was a follow-up article 2 weeks later stating that the investigation had concluded it was an accident, no foul play suspected. But now, knowing what he knew about the documents hidden in Karl's bicycle, Thomas read those articles with new eyes. The fire had occurred in the middle of the night, had spread with unusual speed, had been so intense that firefighters could not enter the building until it was too late. The investigation had been brief and cursory, the conclusion reached quickly with little apparent effort to rule out other possibilities. In a small town where Antonin Krupka had influence and resources, would it have been difficult to ensure that an investigation found exactly what it was supposed to find? Thomas printed out the most relevant articles, paying for the copies with coins from his pocket, and tucked them into his jacket. He thanked Mrs. Kermakova and left the library, stepping out into the afternoon sunshine that seemed too bright and cheerful for the dark thoughts occupying his mind. He walked without direction, letting his feet carry him through the familiar streets, while his brain worked to process everything he had learned. He thought about going to see Antonin Krupka directly, confronting him with the evidence from Karol's letters, but dismissed the idea almost immediately. If Krupka had killed Karol to protect his secrets, or had arranged for someone else to do it, then Thomas would be putting himself in danger by revealing what he knew. He needed to be smarter than that, needed to find a way to bring the truth to light without making himself a target. His wandering brought him eventually to the church, a stone building with a bell tower that dominated the town square. Father Novotny was tending the flower beds in front of the Ettul entrance, and he straightened when he saw Thomas approaching, greeting him warmly. They had known each other for years, had served together on various community committees, and the priest had been a great comfort to Thomas after Anna died, visiting regularly and offering companionship without judgment or pressure. Thomas found himself sitting on the church steps with Father Novotny, and before he quite realized what he was doing, he was telling the priest everything. About the bicycle and the stranger and the photograph, about the documents hidden in the frame and what they revealed about Karol Svoboda's work in the resistance and Antonin Krupka's collaboration with the secret police. Father Novotny listened without interrupting, his weathered face grave and thoughtful, and when Thomas finished speaking, there was a long silence. Finally, Father Novotny spoke, his voice quiet but firm. He said that Thomas had stumbled onto something important, something that went beyond a simple bicycle repair, and that he needed to be very careful about how he proceeded. The priest admitted that he had heard rumors over the years about Antonin Krupka's past, whispers that suggested his success had not been entirely honest, but there had never been proof, never anything concrete enough to act upon. The documents Thomas had found could change that, could finally bring accountability for crimes that had been hidden for too long. But Father Novotny also warned that powerful men like Krupka did not give up their positions easily, that they had resources and connections that ordinary people could not match. He urged Thomas to think carefully about his own safety, about what he was willing to risk for the sake of truth and justice. Thomas appreciated the priest's concern, but felt a growing sense of obligation, a feeling that he had been chosen somehow to carry this burden, that Karol Svoboda's hidden documents had found their way to him for a reason. He thought about the man in the photograph, young and idealistic, risking his life to help others escape tyranny. He thought about Josef Marek dying too young after suffering so much for his principles. He thought about all the people who had been betrayed by informants like Krupka, whose lives had been destroyed by those who chose collaboration over courage. Could he really just return the bicycle and pretend he had never seen what it contained? Could he live with himself if he did nothing? Father Novotny seemed to understand the struggle happening inside Thomas's heart. He said that sometimes God placed us in difficult positions, not to test our faith, but to give us opportunities to live according to our values, to stand for what was right, even when it was hard. He offered to help however he could, said that the church had resources and connections beyond the town, contacts with journalists and human rights organizations who specialized in documenting the crimes of the communist era. Together they might be able to bring the documents to light in a way that protected Thomas, while still ensuring that the truth was told. Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders at the priest's words, realizing that he did not have to carry this alone. that there were people who would stand with him. They made a plan sitting there on the church steps. Thomas would finish restoring the bicycle as promised, would act as if nothing unusual had happened. When the man calling himself Pavel came to collect it, Thomas would give it to him without revealing that he knew about the hidden compartment. But before that happened, Thomas would make copies of all the documents, would photograph every page, and provide those images to Father Novotny, who would in turn share them with trusted contacts outside of Lipova. That way, even if something happened to the originals, even if Pavel found and destroyed them, the information would survive. It was not a perfect plan, but it was better than trying to handle everything alone. Over the next few days, Thomas worked steadily on the bicycle, bringing it back to life with the care and attention he gave all his projects. He replaced the worn parts, cleaned and polished the frame until the blue paint gleamed, adjusted every component until the bicycle rode as smoothly as it must have when it was new. Martin commented on how much time Thomas was spending on this particular repair, wondered aloud why he was putting so much effort into a bicycle for a customer who had paid a fairly modest price. Thomas just smiled and said that some projects deserved extra attention, that this bicycle had a history worth honoring. He did not tell Martin about the documents or the mystery surrounding the bicycle's owner, wanting to keep the boy out of danger, wanting to protect him from knowledge that could put him at risk. One evening, as Thomas was locking up the shop, preparing to go home, he noticed a black car parked across the street, its windows tinted dark so he could not see who sat inside. The car had not been there when he arrived that morning, and something about it made him uneasy. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, pretending to check his phone while watching the car from the corner of his eye. It did not move. The engine was not running, but he had the distinct sense that someone inside was watching him. He walked home by a different route than usual, taking side streets and checking frequently to see if he was being followed. The black car did not follow him, at least not that he could see, but the encounter left him shaken. He mentioned it to Father Novotny the next day when they met at the church to transfer the photographed documents. The priest's expression grew serious, and he said that they needed to move quickly, that if Krupka or whoever was protecting him had already noticed Thomas's interest in Karl Svoboda, then time was running short. Father Novotny had already made contact with a journalist in Prague, a woman who specialized in investigating crimes from the communist era, and she was very interested in seeing the documents. He suggested that Thomas give him the photographs immediately so they could be sent to her before anything else happened. Thomas agreed and handed over his phone, watching as the priest carefully transferred all the images to a secure email account. Within an hour, the documents were in the hands of someone who could do something with them, someone beyond the reach of Antonin Krupka's influence. Thomas felt simultaneously relieved and more anxious than before, knowing that he had set events in motion that could not be stopped, that would have consequences he could not fully predict. 2 days later, Pavel called. His voice on the phone was tense, impatient, asking if the bicycle was ready. Thomas said it was, that he had completed the restoration, and it looked beautiful, riding better than it probably had in decades. Pavel said he would come by that afternoon to collect it, and there was something in his tone that made Thomas's instincts prickle with warning. He called Father Novotny immediately after hanging up, told him that Pavel was coming for the bicycle. The priest said he would be nearby, would keep watch from across the street, and that if anything seemed wrong, Thomas should come to the church immediately. It was a small comfort, but better than nothing. Thomas spent the morning preparing, making sure the bicycle was perfect, polishing away every fingerprint and smudge. He placed it prominently near the front of the shop, where Pavel would see it immediately upon entering. Then he positioned himself at his workbench, where he could watch the door while appearing to be engaged in routine work. He tried to keep his hands steady as he pretended to adjust a derailleur on another bicycle, tried to keep his breathing calm and even. Around 2 o'clock, the bell above the door chimed and Pavel entered. He looked different than he had on his first visit, more confident somehow, less nervous. His eyes went immediately to the restored bicycle, and something flickered across his face, an expression Thomas could not quite read. Satisfaction, perhaps, or relief, or maybe something darker. Pavel walked over to the bicycle and ran his hand along the frame, almost caressing it, and Thomas noticed that his fingers went straight to the bottom bracket area, touching it briefly as if checking for something. Thomas kept his expression neutral, professional, as he greeted Pavel and began explaining all the work he had done. He detailed every repair, every replacement part, speaking in the calm tone he used with all his customers, giving no indication that anything unusual had occurred. Pavel seemed barely to hear him, his attention focused entirely on the bicycle. And when Thomas finished speaking, Pavel simply nodded and reached for his wallet. Pavel paid quickly, counting out bills without bothering to verify the amount, clearly eager to leave with the bicycle. But just as he was turning toward the door, wheel the bicycle with him, Thomas found himself speaking, the words coming out before he could stop them. He asked Pavel if his father had really owned the bicycle, if the story about wanting to restore it in his father's memory had been true. Pavel froze, his back still to Thomas, and the silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. When he finally turned around, his face had changed completely, the mask of nervous politeness gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. He asked Thomas why he was asking such a question, what business it was of his beyond completing the repair he had been paid to do. Thomas felt his heart hammering in his chest, but forced himself to stay calm. He said he had found something while working on the bicycle, a photograph hidden in the frame, and that the photograph had a name written on it, Karel Svoboda, not Karel Dvorak. He watched Pavel's face carefully as he spoke, saw the flash of alarm quickly suppressed, saw the mental calculations happening behind those cold eyes. Pavel set the bicycle down carefully and took a step toward Thomas. His voice when he spoke was quiet, but carried an edge of menace. He said that Thomas should forget whatever he thought he had found, should forget this conversation ever happened, should go back to fixing bicycles and minding his own business. There were things about this situation that Thomas did not understand, Pavel said, dangerous things that were better left alone. Smart men knew when to ask questions and when to stay silent, and if Thomas was smart, he would choose silence. Thomas felt fear coursing through him, but also anger. Anger at being threatened in his own shop. Anger at the arrogance of this man who thought he could intimidate and manipulate without consequence. He said he knew about Karel Svoboda, knew he had died in a fire 10 years ago, knew the fire had been ruled an accident, but that there had been questions. He said he knew about the resistance work Karel had done, about the people he had helped escape, about the documents he had kept. Pavel's expression shifted from threatening to something else, something almost like surprise, and he laughed, a sound without humor. He said that Thomas had indeed been busy, had been asking questions and digging into things that did not concern him, and that was unfortunate because it meant decisions would have to be made about what to do with him. But then Pavel's demeanor changed again, became almost conversational, and he pulled up a stool and sat down, as if settling in for a long chat. He said he would tell Thomas the truth, or at least part of it, because maybe if Thomas understood the full picture, he would see why the past needed to stay buried. His real name was not Pavel Dvorak, he admitted, but he was not going to share his actual name. He worked for someone with resources and influence, someone who had a great deal to lose if certain information from the communist era became public. Karel Svoboda had been a problem, Pavel said. A man who could not let go of the past, who had collected evidence and documentation with the intention of one day exposing everyone who had collaborated with the regime. After the Velvet Revolution, Karel had become increasingly vocal about the need for accountability, had started making inquiries, asking questions, contacting former resistance members. He had been warned to stop, had been offered money to keep quiet, but he had refused. So yes, Pavel admitted with chilling casualness, the fire had not been an accident. It had been necessary, a solution to a problem that would not go away on its own. But Karel had been smarter than they gave him credit for, had hidden his most damaging evidence somewhere they could not find it. They had searched his house before burning it, had gone through everything, but the documents they most needed to destroy were not there. For 10 years they had searched, following every lead, tracking down anyone who might have known Karel, might have been trusted with his secrets. And finally, they had gotten a break. An old storage unit that Karel had rented under a false name had been discovered, and inside it they found the bicycle. They knew from intercepted letters that Karel had mentioned hiding something important in a safe place, somewhere no one would think to look, and the bicycle seemed the most likely candidate. So Pavel had been sent to retrieve it, to bring it somewhere it could be thoroughly searched without attracting attention, and a bicycle repair shop had seemed perfect for that purpose. Thomas listened to this confession with growing horror, understanding that he was in much more danger than he had realized. Pavel was admitting to murder, was describing a conspiracy that had lasted a decade, and he was doing it with the confidence of someone who believed there would be no consequences, that Thomas posed no real threat. Thomas asked, trying to keep his voice steady, what Pavel intended to do now. Pavel smiled, not a pleasant expression, and said that depended on Thomas. If Thomas had truly found documents in the bicycle, if he had read them or made copies, then things would become complicated. But if he was simply curious, if he had found only the photograph and nothing more, then perhaps they could reach an understanding. Thomas made a split-second decision, one that could save his life or end it. He lied, said he had found only the photograph, had not discovered any other hidden compartments or documents. He said he had been curious about the discrepancy in names, had asked a few questions around town, but had not learned anything significant. He was just a bicycle mechanic, he said, not an investigator or a crusader for justice, and he had no interest in getting involved in matters that did not concern him. Pavel studied him for a long moment, those cold eyes searching for any sign of deception. Then he seemed to reach a decision. He said he believed Thomas, mostly, but that his employer would want verification. He pulled out his phone and made a call, speaking in low tones that Thomas could not quite make out. When he finished, he said that someone would be coming to the shop shortly, someone who would ask Thomas a few questions, and if Thomas answered honestly and convinced them that he knew nothing important, then he would be left alone. But if he was lying, if he had found and copied the documents, then things would go very badly for him. Pavel picked up the bicycle again and wheeled it toward the door. Just before he left, he turned back to Thomas and said one more thing. He said that Thomas should think very carefully about who he trusted, about who he talked to, because in a small town like Lipova, there were more people connected to this situation than Thomas might realize, people who had their own reasons for wanting the past to stay buried. Then he was gone, the bell chiming cheerfully as the door closed behind him, leaving Thomas alone with his racing thoughts and pounding heart. Thomas stood frozen for a moment, processing what had just happened, then moved quickly to lock the door and flip the sign to closed. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and called Father Novotny, spoke in urgent whispers about Pavel's visit and his confession, and the threat of someone coming to question him. The priest told him to come to the church immediately, to leave through the back entrance of his shop, and take the alley route where he would be less visible. Thomas grabbed his jacket and did exactly that, slipping out the back door and moving as quickly as he dared through the narrow alleyway behind the buildings. He had gone perhaps 50 meters when he heard footsteps behind him, heavy and fast, and he broke into a run, his heart hammering with fear and adrenaline. He burst out onto a side street and nearly collided with someone, stumbling back and raising his hands defensively. But it was not one of Pavel's associates. It was Martin, his young helper, who grabbed Thomas by the arm and pulled him into a doorway. Martin said he had been watching the shop, had seen Pavel leave with the bicycle, and had noticed the black car that pulled up right after, the same black car that had been parked across the street days before. He had guessed that Thomas was in trouble and had come to help, and now he said they needed to move quickly because 2 men had just entered the shop looking for Thomas, and they did not look like the patient type. Thomas and Martin moved quickly through the back streets of Lipova, staying away from the main roads, ducking into doorways whenever they heard a car approach. Martin proved surprisingly resourceful, knowing shortcuts and hidden paths that Thomas had forgotten existed, routes the young people used to move through town unseen. They made their way to the church through a circuitous route that took twice as long as it should have, but kept them out of sight. Father Novotny was waiting for them in the small office behind the sanctuary, his face drawn with worry. He ushered them inside quickly and locked the door, then pulled the curtains closed over the windows. He had already heard from his contact in Prague, the journalist who had received the photographed documents, and the news was both encouraging and alarming. The journalist had verified that the documents were authentic and extremely significant, containing evidence that could lead to prosecutions of several high-profile individuals who had reinvented themselves as respectable businessmen and politicians after the fall of communism. She wanted to publish the story immediately, but Father Novotny had convinced her to wait 48 hours to give Thomas time to get somewhere safe. The problem was that the journalists' inquiries had apparently triggered alarms somewhere, someone monitoring for exactly this kind of investigation, and now multiple parties knew that Karol Svoboda's hidden documents had surfaced. It was no longer just about Antonin Krupka protecting his own secrets, the priest explained, but about a network of former collaborators who had built their current lives on the foundation of their past crimes, and they would do whatever necessary to prevent exposure. Thomas felt overwhelmed by the scope of what he had stumbled into, felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He had just wanted to repair a bicycle, to do his job with the care and attention he brought to all his work, and now he was caught in something much larger and more dangerous than he could have imagined. He asked Father Novotny what they should do, where he could go that would be safe. The priest had already thought about this, had made arrangements with a monastery 2 hours away, where Thomas could stay until the story broke and the documents became public. Once everything was out in the open, once the evidence had been published and distributed widely, there would be no point in silencing Thomas, no way to undo the damage. But until then he needed to disappear, needed to be somewhere these people could not reach him. Martin spoke up then, his young voice firm with determination. He said he knew Thomas had found something in the bicycle, had guessed from the way Thomas had been acting lately that the repair job was more than it seemed. He wanted to help, wanted to do whatever was necessary to make sure the truth came out. Thomas tried to protest, tried to tell Martin that this was not his fight, that he should go home and stay out of it for his own safety. But Martin shook his head stubbornly and said that if people like Antonin Krupka had gotten away with their crimes for so long, it was because good people had stayed silent, had decided it was not their problem. He did not want to be that kind of person, did not want to live in a world where the powerful could do whatever they wanted without consequences. Father Novotny looked at both of them with something like pride in his eyes, and said that courage came in many forms, that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was stand up for what was right, even when it was dangerous. He outlined a plan, speaking with the calm authority of someone who had thought through every detail. Thomas would leave for the monastery within the hour, traveling with a driver Father Novotny trusted completely, taking nothing but the clothes on his back so there would be nothing to track. Martin would go home and act as if everything was normal, would tell anyone who asked that Thomas had left town to visit a sick relative, a plausible story that would buy them time. Father Novotny himself would stay in Lipova and serve as a contact point, would deal with any inquiries and deflect attention away from Thomas's actual location. In 48 hours, the journalist would publish her story, complete with scanned copies of all the documents, and the whole conspiracy would be exposed. Mrs. Novakova knocked on the office door then, her face pale with anxiety. She said there were men asking about Thomas at his house, 2 men in dark suits who claimed to be police officers, but who she did not recognize. They had knocked on her door, asking if she knew where Thomas was, when she had last seen him, whether he had mentioned taking a trip. She had told them she did not know anything, had not seen Thomas all day, and they had left, but she was certain they were watching the house now, waiting for him to return. Thomas felt a surge of gratitude toward his neighbor, this elderly woman who had looked after him with such care, and he assured her that he was fine, that he just needed to stay out of sight for a few days until some business was resolved. Mrs. Novakova reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong, and said she had lived through the communist years, remembered what it was like when the secret police came asking questions. She told him to be careful, to trust no one he did not absolutely have to trust, and to remember that the truth was worth fighting for, even when it came at great personal cost. The driver arrived shortly after, a quiet man in his 60s who Father Novotny introduced simply as Joseph, no last name offered. Joseph said his car was parked behind the church, out of sight from the street, and that he knew back roads that would get them to the monastery without using any major highways. Thomas gathered himself to leave, but Father Novotny stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. The priest said there was one more thing they needed to discuss, something Thomas needed to understand before he left. The journalist in Prague had discovered something else while researching the people named in Karel Svoboda's documents, something that connected directly to the present day and explained why the conspiracy to hide these crimes had been so persistent and so well organized. Antonin Krupka was not just a local businessman trying to protect his reputation. He was part of a larger network of former informants and collaborators who had positioned themselves in strategic places throughout the country after the revolution. They had infiltrated businesses, government agencies, law enforcement, using their connections and their willingness to engage in corruption to build power and wealth. Some of them had even risen to positions in the new democratic government, had become the very people tasked with investigating and prosecuting crimes from the communist era. It was a shadow organization, Father Novotny explained, not formal or hierarchical, but connected through mutual self-interest and shared guilt. They protected each other because if one of them fell, if one person's collaboration was fully exposed and prosecuted, it could lead to dozens or hundreds of others being investigated as well. That was why Karol Swoboda's documents were so dangerous, why his death had been ordered, and why they were willing to threaten and possibly kill Tomasz to keep the information hidden. The documents were not just evidence against individual people, but proof of a systemic corruption that had infected the very institutions meant to bring justice. Tomasz absorbed this information with a growing sense of the magnitude of what he was involved in. He asked Father Nowotny if the priest was certain they should proceed, if publishing these documents might not cause more harm than good, might not destabilize institutions that the country needed. Father Nowotny's response was firm and uncompromising. He said that institutions built on lies and corruption were not worth preserving, that real stability could only come from truth and accountability, that societies that refused to confront their past were condemned to repeat it. The priest quoted scripture then, speaking about truth setting people free, about the importance of bringing hidden things to light, about the responsibility each person had to stand against injustice even when it was difficult or dangerous. Tomasz nodded slowly, feeling a sense of clarity and purpose settling over him. He thought about Anna, about how she had always believed in doing the right thing, regardless of convenience, about how she had taught him through her example that integrity meant making hard choices and living with the consequences. He thought about Karol Swoboda, a man he had never met, but whose courage had preserved evidence that could change lives. He thought about all the people who had suffered because of collaborators like Krupka, people who had been imprisoned or exiled or killed because someone they trusted had betrayed them. And he knew that he could not walk away, could not choose the easy path of silence and safety. He had been given a responsibility, perhaps by chance, or perhaps by something more, and he would see it through to the end. The journey to the monastery was tense and quiet, Joseph driving carefully through the darkness, taking roads that wound through forests and small villages, avoiding any route where they might encounter checkpoints or surveillance. Tomasz sat in the passenger seat, watching the landscape pass by in the moonlight, thinking about everything that had happened in the past week, marveling at how quickly a quiet, ordinary life could transform into something dangerous and consequential. He wondered what would happen after the story broke, whether there would be arrests and trials, whether real justice would be served, or whether the powerful would find ways to evade accountability, as they always seemed to do. He wondered if he would be able to return to his simple life in Lipova, to his bicycle shop and his daily routines, or if this experience had changed him too fundamentally to ever go back. They arrived at the monastery near midnight, a collection of stone buildings surrounded by high walls, looking ancient and impregnable in the darkness. Joseph pulled up to a heavy wooden gate and rang a bell, and after a few minutes, a monk appeared, elderly and calm, greeting them with quiet courtesy. Father Nowotny had called ahead to explain the situation, and the monk led Tomasz to a simple room with a narrow bed and a single window looking out over the monastery gardens. He said Tomasz was welcome to stay as long as necessary, that the monastery had a long history of providing sanctuary to those in need, and that no one would disturb him here. Tomasz spent the next 2 days in the monastery, trying to maintain some semblance of calm, while his mind raced with anxiety and anticipation. The monks maintained their routine of prayer and work with serene discipline, seemingly unaffected by the drama unfolding in the outside world, and their peace was both comforting and surreal. He attended services in the chapel, finding unexpected solace in the ancient rituals, even though he had never been particularly religious. The rhythmic chanting and the smell of incense created a space where his worried thoughts could quiet for brief moments, where he could remember that there were things larger and more enduring than his immediate fears. He tried to keep himself occupied with simple tasks, helping in the monastery garden, sweeping the courtyard, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from spiraling into worst-case scenarios. The monks asked no questions about why he was there, respecting his privacy with a courtesy that felt like a gift. Father Novotny called twice a day with updates, his voice carefully neutral over the phone in case the line was being monitored. He reported that men were still looking for Thomas in Lipova, had questioned several people, including Mrs. Novakova again, and Martin's parents, but no one had any information to give them. The bicycle shop remained closed, a handwritten sign on the door saying that Thomas had a family emergency and would return soon. Pavel had not been seen again, but the black car continued to appear at various locations around town, its occupants clearly searching for any sign of where Thomas might have gone. On the Sashkot, morning of the third day, Father Novotny called with different news. His voice was tight with tension as he said that the journalist in Prague was preparing to publish the story that evening, that it would appear on the website of a major newspaper and would be picked up by international media within hours. The documents had been verified by multiple historical experts, the testimonies cross-referenced with existing records, and the evidence was irrefutable. Several prominent individuals would be named, their activities during the communist era detailed with precision and supporting documentation. Antonin Krupka was among them, as were 2 members of parliament, a high-ranking police official, and several wealthy businessmen. The story would send shockwaves through the country, would reignite debates about how to handle the legacy of collaboration, and would almost certainly lead to legal proceedings. Father Novotny said that once the story was published, Thomas should be safe to return, that there would be no point in threatening or silencing him once everything was public. But he cautioned that the next few hours would be the most dangerous, that desperate people might make desperate choices, and Thomas should remain at the monastery until they were absolutely certain the situation had stabilized. Thomas thanked the priest and sat in his small room, watching the afternoon light fade through the window, waiting for something he could not quite name. He thought about calling Martin, checking to make sure the boy was safe. But Father Novotny had advised against making any unnecessary phone calls that could be traced. So he waited, counting the minutes, imagining the journalist in Prague putting the final touches on her article, imagining the moment it would go live on the internet for the whole world to see. Evening came, and the monastery bells rang for vespers. Thomas went to the chapel and sat in the back, listening to the monks sing, finding comfort in the ancient words, even though he did not understand all of them. His phone was on silent in his pocket, and he felt it buzz once, twice, 3 times, messages coming through, but he did not check them, did not want to disturb the sanctity of the space or the fragile peace he had found. When the service ended and the monks filed out, Thomas finally looked at his phone. The first message was from Father Novotny, just 2 words. "It is done." The second message was a link to the newspaper article, and Thomas clicked on it with trembling hands. The headline was stark and uncompromising, naming names and promising revelations. Below it was the journalist's byline and a photograph of Karol Svoboda, the same image Thomas had found in the bicycle frame, now reproduced for thousands of people to see. Thomas began to read, his heart pounding as he recognized passages from the letters and documents he had found, now contextualized with historical background and expert analysis. The article laid out the full scope of Carroll's resistance work, documented the network he had helped build to smuggle people to freedom, and then detailed the betrayals that had led to arrests and imprisonments. Each collaborator was named, their specific actions described, the consequences of their betrayals enumerated. Antonin Krupka's section was particularly damning, describing how he had reported on colleagues and neighbors, how he had used information from the secret police to eliminate business competitors, how he had profited from his collaboration both during and after the communist regime. The article also addressed the fire that killed Karol Swoboda, presenting evidence that suggested it had not been accidental, but rather a targeted killing designed to silence him and destroy his documentation. The journalist had interviewed fire investigators who admitted that the original investigation had been rushed and superficial, that there had been anomalies in the burn patterns consistent with accelerants, that the speed and intensity of the fire had never been fully explained. She had also discovered that one of the investigators assigned to the case had connections to Antonin Krupka, had received payments from Krupka's construction company shortly after the investigation was closed. It was not proof of murder in a legal sense, but it was enough to raise serious questions and to justify reopening the case. Thomas scrolled through the article, reading every word, seeing Karol Swoboda's story told with the respect and attention it deserved. The journalist had done excellent work, presenting the evidence clearly and compellingly while maintaining journalistic objectivity, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. At the end of the article was a note explaining how the documents had been preserved and how they had recently come to light, mentioning a bicycle that Karol had used to hide his most sensitive materials, though it did not name Thomas or reveal his location. There was a quote from Father Novotny speaking about the importance of confronting historical injustices and honoring the courage of those who had resisted tyranny. The third message on Thomas's phone was from Martin, excited and barely coherent, saying that the story was everywhere, that social media was exploding with reactions, that news vans were arriving in Lipova to cover the story. He said that Antonin Krupka's grocery store had been vandalized, windows smashed and graffiti spray painted on the walls, that police were trying to maintain order, but that people were angry, demanding accountability. Martin also reported that the two men who had been searching for Thomas had left town abruptly, their black car seen speeding away on the highway, heading toward Prague. It seemed that once the story broke, their mission had become pointless, their threats rendered impotent by the public exposure of everything they had tried to keep hidden. Thomas felt a complex mixture of emotions as he absorbed all this information. Relief that the truth was finally out, that Karol Swoboda's courage had not been in vain. Satisfaction that people like Krupka would finally face consequences for their actions. But also sadness for all the years that had been lost, for Josef Marek, who had died before seeing justice, for all the victims of collaboration who had never received acknowledgement or recompense. And underneath it all, a bone-deep weariness, the exhaustion that comes after prolonged tension, finally releases. He called Father Novotny, who answered immediately, his voice warm with relief and congratulation. The priest said that Thomas had done something remarkable, that his curiosity and courage had brought to light truths that had been buried for too long. He said that prosecutors were already reviewing the evidence, that there would likely be investigations and possibly trials, that this story would have repercussions for years to come. But for now, Father Novotny said, Thomas should rest, should stay at the monastery one more night to be absolutely certain it was safe, and then return home tomorrow to resume his life. Thomas agreed, feeling suddenly overwhelmed with longing for his own bed, his own house, the familiar comfort of his workshop. That night he slept deeply for the first time since finding the photograph in the bicycle frame, his dreams peaceful and untroubled. He woke to morning light streaming through the window and the sound of bells calling the monks to prayer. After a simple breakfast of bread and tea, Joseph arrived to drive him back to Lipowa. The return journey felt different from the desperate flight 3 days earlier, the landscape seeming brighter somehow, full of possibility rather than threat. They drove through the morning sunshine, past forests turning gold with autumn colors, past small villages where life continued its timeless rhythms. Joseph, who had been silent during the first trip, now spoke a little, sharing that he too had been involved in the resistance during the communist years, had spent time in prison for his activities, and had devoted his life since then to helping others who fought against injustice. He said he was honored to have played even a small part in bringing Karol Swoboda's story to light, that it gave meaning to his own suffering to know that the struggle for truth continued across generations. When they reached the outskirts of Lipowa, Thomas could see that the town was transformed. News vans lined the streets, reporters interviewing residents, cameras pointed at Antonin Krupka's businesses, which now had police tape across their entrances. People gathered in small groups on street corners, talking animatedly, their expressions a mixture of shock and vindication. Some of them recognized Thomas as Josef's car drove past, and they pointed and waved, and Thomas was startled to realize that he had become part of this story, that his role in uncovering the truth was apparently known despite the journalist's discretion. Joseph dropped him at his house, refusing Thomas's offer of payment, saying that some services could not and should not be paid for in money. Mrs. Novakova was waiting on her porch when Thomas arrived home, and she rushed over to embrace him with tears in her eyes, saying she had been so worried that she had prayed for his safety every day. She ushered him into his own house as if he were a guest, insisting on making him coffee and something to eat, fussing over him with the fierce tenderness of someone who had feared they might never see him again. While she worked in his kitchen, Thomas sat in his living room and looked around at the familiar space, at Anna's chair and her books, and all the small objects that held memories. Everything looked exactly as he had left it, yet somehow different, as if he were seeing it all through new eyes. He had left this house as a simple bicycle mechanic, a widower living a quiet life, and he had returned as something else. Someone who had stood up against corruption and won, someone whose actions would have consequences far beyond his small workshop. Martin arrived within the hour, bursting through the door with his characteristic energy, talking rapidly about everything that had happened while Thomas was gone. The boy said that reporters had tried to interview him, asking what he knew about the bicycle and Thomas's discovery, but Martin had refused to speak to them, had protected Thomas's privacy as Father Novotny had instructed. He said that school had been chaotic, that teachers and students were talking about nothing but the revelations, that history classes had turned into discussions about collaboration and resistance, and how to judge the actions of people who had lived in impossible circumstances. Martin said he was proud to have helped, even in a small way, and that the experience had taught him something important about standing up for what was right. Father Novotny came by that evening, bringing news and updates. He said that Antonin Krupka had been arrested that morning, charged with perjury and fraud related to his business dealings, with more serious charges likely to follow as the investigation into Karol Swoboda's death was formally reopened. Several other individuals named in the article had also been taken into custody or were under investigation. The priest said there would be a long legal process ahead, that trials could take years, but that the important thing was that the truth was now known, that the historical record had been corrected, that victims and their families finally had acknowledgement of what had been done to them. He also said that Thomas should prepare himself for attention, that reporters would want to interview him, that his role in the story was bound to become public. But Father Novotny assured him that he did not have to speak to anyone if he did not want to, that his actions spoke for themselves, and that he had every right to privacy. Over the following weeks, life in Lipova slowly returned to a new kind of normal. Thomas reopened his bicycle shop, resuming his daily routine of repairs and conversations with customers. But things had changed in subtle ways. People treated him differently now, with a respect that went beyond his skills as a mechanic, sometimes stopping by just to shake his hand or thank him for his courage. Some customers brought him small gifts, homemade cakes or bottles of wine, tokens of appreciation that he accepted with embarrassment and gratitude. He found that he could not quite return to the solitary existence he had lived before, that the experience had opened him up in ways he had not expected, made him more willing to engage with the community, to accept companionship and connection. The journalist from Prague came to visit him, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a warm smile, wanting to thank him personally for preserving the documents and bringing them to light. She said that Karol Svoboda's story had resonated across the country and beyond, that it had sparked a renewed conversation about how societies deal with their past, that several other countries in the former Soviet bloc were now re-examining their own histories of collaboration and resistance. She asked if she could write a follow-up article focusing on Thomas and how the bicycle had come to him, and after some hesitation, he agreed, thinking that perhaps Karol deserved to have his full story told, including the unlikely chain of events that had finally brought his evidence into the light. One quiet morning, several months after everything had happened, Thomas was working in his shop when an elderly woman came in, leaning on a cane, her face lined with age, but her eyes bright and alert. She introduced herself as Helena Svoboda, Karol's younger sister, someone he had not known existed. She said she had been living in Austria for decades, had left Czechoslovakia during the Prague Spring, and never returned, and she had only learned about her brother's death years after it happened. She had thought everything of his was lost in the fire, had mourned not just his death but the disappearance of his legacy. When she saw the article about the documents found in his bicycle, when she learned that his resistance work was finally being recognized and honored, she had wept with joy and grief mixed together. She had come to thank Thomas, to see the shop where the bicycle had been repaired, to touch something connected to her brother's life and courage. Thomas showed her the photographs he had taken of the documents before sending them to Father Novotny, and they sat together in the quiet workshop while she read her brother's words, tears streaming down her weathered face. She told Thomas stories about Karol as a young man, about his idealism and his gentle nature, about how he had always believed that one person could make a difference if they had the courage to try. She said that Karol would have been pleased to know that his carefully preserved evidence had finally served its purpose, that justice was being pursued, even if it came too late for him to see. Before she left, Helena reached into her purse and pulled out an old photograph, different from the one Thomas had found in the bicycle frame. This one showed Karol as a boy, maybe 10 years old, standing next to a bicycle, his face bright with joy. She gave it to Thomas, said she wanted him to have it, wanted him to remember that behind all the documents and revelations and legal proceedings was a real person, someone who had loved simple pleasures like riding a bicycle on a sunny day. Thomas accepted the photograph with gratitude, and after Helena left, he placed it in a small frame on his workbench where he could see it while he worked. It reminded him that every bicycle that came through his shop carried not just mechanical components, but human stories, memories, and dreams, and sometimes secrets that deserved to be honored. He thought about Anna, about how she would have handled all of this with such grace, and he felt her presence in the workshop, as he always did, a warmth that comforted rather than saddened him now. He had learned something through this experience, something about the responsibility that comes with knowledge, about the courage required to do the right thing even when it is frightening, about the way small actions can ripple out in unexpected ways to change the world. As evening fell and the light faded from the workshop windows, Thomas locked up and walked home through the familiar streets of Lipova, grateful for his quiet life, for the community that surrounded him, for the chance to have played a part in bringing truth to light, and for the simple dignity of work well done.